Okay, hello everybody. It's Phil Lee. It's now Tuesday, the 9th of February, 2021. And today's topic is going to be how 1860 presidential candidates truly differed. But before I begin, please click on the, in the upper right on the notification bell to be notified the next time I have an episode of Civil War Chat. Okay, let me pull up my notes and we'll begin with my remarks. How 1860 presidential candidates truly differed. Most students of the War Between the States realize that the results of the 1860 presidential election somehow led to the war. Their understanding, however, is often faulty because academic historians have long been ignoring inconvenient truths that tend to put blame on Lincoln's Republican Party. That is taboo in academia today. The only cause of the Civil War were the evil Southerners. At the start of 1860, America had two political parties, Republicans and Democrats. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln on a platform of two basic tenets pertaining to slavery. Now, there were other differences, but two differences pertaining to slavery. First, the party believed that Congress had the right to outlaw slaves in the federal territories. Second, one of their planks wanted to block the immigration of slaves into any extant federal territory in 1860. And almost all of those were west of Texas and the Missouri River. In contrast, the Democrats denied that Congress had the authority to dictate slaveholding status in any territory. Two of the party's chief leaders, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas and Vice President John Breckinridge of Kentucky, both worked hard to secure passage of the earlier 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act that stipulated each new state would decide their slaveholding status for themselves, based upon popular sovereignty, which was a term that meant essentially a local option popular vote, an option within that territory that would become a state. When the Democrats met in convention to nominate a candidate, the party split on a fine point of popular sovereignty. Based upon a speech in Freeport, Illinois in 1858, Douglas's so-called Freeport Doctrine specified that the territorial governments could adopt legislation hostile to slavery before they were admitted as states. The Southern faction held that the territories could only outlaw slavery at the time they applied for statehood. Prior to that, they could not do anything to hinder slavery. By choosing John Breckinridge as their candidate, the Southern faction showed a readiness to accept popular sovereignty as a legitimate method for determining slaveholding status at the time of statehood. A fourth political party formed during the year. The basically conservative Constitutional Union Party believed that a strict constructional interpretation of the Constitution was the best way to hold the Union together, which was their primary objective. The year 2021 vantage point shows that the 1858 popular sovereignty vote in Kansas had demonstrated conclusively that popular sovereignty could have kept slavery quarantined in the South peacefully without a war, which supposedly the Republican Party was supposedly the Republican Party's goal. If slaveholders could not make popular sovereignty create a slave state in Kansas, they could not do so in any of the remaining federal territories where the climate was even less amenable to slave-based agriculture. Thus, Republican Party insistence on a blanket ban on slaves in the territories was unnecessary. They could have accomplished their goal peacefully by backing popular sovereignty. They refused to do so only because it would have made their party irrelevant and thereby lead to its extinction. It would have been political suicide to say everything that they had been based on previously with respect to slavery was unnecessary. A vote for the Republican Party in 1860 was a vote for the breakup of the United States, undeniably. Now, that was not true for a vote for the other candidates. Moreover, the Kansas experience showed that the anti-slavery sentiments in the West were not the morally commendable tenets that most modern historians attribute to them, but were instead a manifestation of vile anti-Black racism. Kansas began its path toward the final 1858 popular vote on slaveholding. That path began in 1855. The first 1855 Constitution was pro-slavery. It was written by delegates chosen in an election endorsed by the territorial governor. Although the governor removed pro-slavery votes in all but one of the districts where Free State voters alleged ballot stuffing, the Free Staters they ignored the pro-slavery convention and its constitution. In response, they wrote their own so-called 1855 Topeka Constitution. It was a, quote, free state constitution. Significantly, however, the Topeka Constitution not only outlawed the immigration of Black slaves into Kansas, but also the immigration of free Blacks. Thus, the so-called Kansas Free State advocates were obviously anti-Black. Oregon would do the same thing when it was admitted to the Union in 1859. Blacks, whether slave or free, were not allowed in Oregon. Despite the growing need for workers, the northern and western states persistently discouraged Black immigration for decades after the Civil War. For 50 years after the war, America's 4 million Blacks and their descendants remained in the South, although 18 million white European immigrants arrived to fuel the North's manufacturing industries. And of course, though, the descendants of those 18 million were also white and also filled those jobs. Not until 1915, 50 years after the war had ended, and when World War I led to a northern labor shortage, did Blacks begin to seek employment north of the Ohio River and Mason-Dixon line. For the most part, they were socially unwelcome and at best tolerated as workers. But their social unwelcomeness is evidenced by the 1919 Chicago race riots that lasted a week and left 38 people dead. Now, I'd like to also bring up, clarify something that I was talking about yesterday, which is the present Democrat Party's intention through a bill introduced in the House to make a state out of Washington, D.C. Now, if you asked most Republicans, whether politicians or registered Republican voters, a large percentage of them would say this is strictly a power play. They want the 2 additional senators and an additional congressman. It's strictly a power play. My guess is probably 75, 80% of Republicans say this is strictly a power play. There's no way the Democrats would do that if they felt that Washington, D.C. would provide 2 new Republican senators. Now, that's pretty obvious to them. But you go back to those same people, I mean, the senators from my state, Rubio and Scott, both white guys. But if you ask them, you know, after the Civil War, do you think that the Republican Party at that time was really trying to promote Black interests? with black suffrage in the South and so-called civil rights for them in the South? Or do you think they were interested in the power that they would get by, having blacks and carpetbaggers control the state regimes in the South, thereby enabling the Republicans to retain power in Washington, D.C.? If you were to ask ordinary white leading Republicans that question, even though 75% of them would say, well, this current power play in Washington is strictly a power play. You ask them the same question regarding the conduct of the Republican Party right after the end of the Civil War. They say, oh, no, that party just simply wanted to do the right thing by the blacks. That was all about. 75% would probably say the current play in Washington, D.C. is a power play, and they would be totally ignorant of how that same principle was used after the Civil War to establish puppet regimes in the South, not for any noble purpose of serving blacks, but for the self-serving purpose of keeping the Republican Party in power. It would probably drop from 75% to 20% or less, I bet. And that is the key to our current situation with Confederate monuments. Logic, which is obvious to our political leaders in the Republican Party and elsewhere, is not applied when looking at the situation at the end of the Civil War. The same logic would lead to the same conclusion if they did so. They would conclude that the Washington, D.C. statehood is a power play, and they would realize that the power play that came after the Civil War was also a power play. The Republican power play was also a power play, just a different party. That is the thing we've got to try and teach them. It's a cliche, but it's as plain as the nose on your face. Okay, now to get this kind of information, you need buy Causes of the Civil War by Philip Lee. This book is going to give you the facts that the academic historians are going to ignore or minimize to their everlasting shame. Causes of the Civil War, available at Barnes & Noble and Amazon for $22. If you want a signed autographed copy, you can get it from me. And if you live here in the States, I will pay the postage. So that would be $25. Just email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H @me.com. Okay, that's our show for today. And thanks for watching.